Fireworks. Lights. Outrageous spectacle. Breathtaking choreography. All wailing, all dancing, five-knuckle shuffle. This thing. Grandad. Nipple.
Just some of the things you wouldn't have seen had you the immense good fortune to sit next to me at the 1973 Super Bowl halftime show. This poor guy not only had the misfortune of wearing that suit on national television, but also of doing a piece to camera, the position of which he was only vaguely aware of. The two acts performing that day at the LA Coliseum, other than the University of Michigan Marching Band, were Woody Herman, who you've never heard of, and Andy Williams, who you've probably never heard of. That song he's singing isn't called Hips Don't Lie or SE Dreams. It's called Marmalade, Molasses and Honey. It was a very different time. Why is this important, I hear you ask? Well, it isn't. That's exactly how I like it. But the journey from this to this started during this halftime show when Noxema spent $42,000 to wear this ad.
Let Noxema cool in your face. Something good won't.
This presaged Super Bowl advertisements like Coca-Cola's Hey Kid Catch and Apple's once iconic but now ironic 1984 ad. It was the moment after which corporate America decided to use the event as a fixture to dangle its wares from, and I decided that I too wanted a golf cart with a giant football helmet glued to it. This gurning hunk is Joe Namath. He's here because he's famous, and he's famous because when he isn't doing the headboard rumba with every woman in town, he sometimes quarterbacks for the New York Jets. The blonde lathering him up is his prospective next dance partner. It's a young and unknown Farrah Fawcett, and sadly, despite her terrific personalities, she's of no moment to the story. That can she's holding, however, is. The science which made this kind of shaving cream possible came from the same place Joe did, Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. You see, Joe just happened to be born in the same small town as one of the most environmentally destructive things to ever live. Its name was Thomas Midgley Jr. If you were to look through the entirety of human history and pick the person who had the most significant impact on the environment, who would you choose? How about my old yurt mate Genghis Khan? When the Mongols came down off the steppe in 1206, they not only created the world's largest contiguous land empire, spanning 23 million square kilometers from the Pacific in the east to the Danube in the west, they also left behind them a death toll so monstrous, thought to be as high as 40 million, or 11% of the world's population, that vast parcels of land formerly populated and under the plough became reforested. It's been estimated that thanks to the Mongolians' unique brand of environmentalism, approximately 700 million tons of carbon was scrubbed from the atmosphere. Genghis was green. Or maybe Christopher Columbus. The discovery of the Americas prompted the greatest exchange of plants, animals, populations, technology, ideas, culture and disease in human history. Are you eating pork in Oshkosh, Wisconsin? That's Columbus. Are you smoking tobacco in Twat on the Orkney Islands? That's Columbus. Are you French and syphilitic? Of course you are. That's Columbus. I'll posit that two men stand head and shoulders above all others in terms of environmental impact. The first is Fritz Haber. The imaginatively named Haber process produces ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen. That ammonia can then be used to manufacture synthetic fertilizers that have been feeding the world since 1913. Half the nitrogen inside you, Dave in Oshkosh, Wisconsin eating pork, comes from the Haber process. In fact, nearly half the world's current population owe their continued existence to Fritz Haber. You should discuss the merits of that last sentence in the comments. The second is Thomas Midgley Jr. But to tell his story, I need to take you back to a time when everyone walked really quickly and wore hats. Dayton, Ohio might look like your typical post-industrial city, but it was a Silicon Valley of the late 19th and early 20th century. If something important was being invented, chances are it was happening in Dayton. If you've ever flown in a plane, started a car, had money handed to you from a cash register, been spied on by the NSA, or not been killed to death by a leaking refrigerator, then you have the remarkable group of men at the apex of industry in Dayton to thank. Some of them you'll be familiar with. like the Wright brothers, while others have been half buried under the sands of time. These latter are John H. Patterson, Edward A. Deeds, and Charles F. Kettering. As befitting a true American story, it all started with a saloon robbery. It was owned by a fellow called James Ritty, and he was sure he was being swindled by his barkeeps. Booze was going out, but the money wasn't coming in. This was a problem usually solved with guns and bad language, but Ritty would find an elegant solution in the unlikeliest of places: the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. In 1878, he found himself in the engine room of a ship en route to Europe. As he stood transfixed by the mechanism which counted propeller rotations, the thought suddenly struck him: if this thing can count money, I won't have to shoot my bartenders. The contraption he went on to develop would, tellingly, be christened the Incorruptible Cashier, better known as the cash register. Ritty sold the patent to the National Manufacturing Company, which was bought out in 1884 by John H. Patterson, who subsequently changed its name to the National Cash Register Company. Patterson had two great gifts: a talent for self-promotion and a flair for firing employees which bordered on the preternatural. In 3 decades, Patterson turned the cash register from an unavailing widget nobody wanted to use to the device at the absolute centre of economic activity. Along the way, he pioneered many of the retailing and merchandising practices still used today, such as sales conventions and testing prospective customers' patience with promotional literature, or, as we call it, junk mail. He even created the world's first training school for salesmen, most of whom he fired. He would fire and rehire the same man multiple times. He would fire entire departments. If you became indispensable, as I did, it went without saying you were fired. Between 1910 and 1930, 1 in 6 of America's top executives had been given the boot by Patterson. His magnum opus was the sacking of salesman Thomas J. Watson. Patterson had Watson's desk, chair, and accoutrements moved outside while he was away from the office, and set ablaze upon his return. This is where the term fired comes from. As was all too common for an ex-Patterson employee, Watson went on to become president of the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, which, in 1924, changed its name to International Business Machines. Edward A. Deeds was born in 1874. It would be 1915 before Patterson finally got around to firing him, so for the moment that didn't trouble him. He grew up in a world that was changing beyond recognition thanks to electricity, a power as inexplicable and bewildering to the population then as the internet is to the elderly today. Sleepless, wealthy housewives worried that leaking wall sockets might ruin their carpets became increasingly commonplace. After spending his formative years watching industry exploit this mysterious new force, Deeds took a degree in science, then continued his studies in electrical engineering at Cornell. By 25, he worked at Thresher Electric in Dayton as a draftsman and installer of electric motors. It just so happened that Thresher Electric was headquartered in the same building as the National Cash Register Company, and in 1899, Patterson's brother Frederick offered Deeds a job upstairs at the NCR, not that one, to build the company's first generator and oversee the electrification of its factories. The NCR, not that one, had the cash register market cornered by the early 1900s, but they were mechanical registers operated by a hand crank. Electrification seemed inevitable to a true believer like Deeds. He was convinced an electric motor could replace the crank, but his busy schedule as NCR's Chief of Development and Construction left him limited time to make his design streamlined. Instead, he hired a bright, gangling young electrical engineer from Ohio State University named Charles Kettering to continue development. Charles F. Kettering had the aspect of a man who was only half sure something wasn't pinned to the back of his blazer, though that wasn't why Patterson fired him. Falling off a horse on a team-building exercise is why Patterson fired him the first time. Kettering was initially assigned by Deeds to Inventions Department No. 3 at the NCR in 1904. Within 2 years, he'd replaced the hand crank with a motor, and the electric cash register was on the market. Before the end of the decade, he had 23 patents to his name. When Kettering found out Deeds was building a suburban 60 kit car in a barn behind his house, he invited himself over. Neither saw a car. They saw shortcomings, limitations, and lousy engineering with a steering wheel attached. What they saw was opportunity. It wasn't long before they began to borrow engineers from the NCR for assistance. This was the beginning of what would later become the Dayton Engineering Laboratory Company, or Delco. The first significant problem Delco solved was a familiar one, a hand crank. Early automobiles were started with a crank handle, which was about as dangerous to the operator as standing behind a recently startled horse. A man named Byron J. Carter, a friend of Cadillac founder Henry Leland, was helping a lady restart her car on the Belle Isle Bridge in Detroit when the crank handle walloped him square in the chops. It broke his jaw, and the complications from gangrene killed him. The lady's car? A Cadillac. This incident allegedly prompted Leland to rid future Cadillac models of the starter crank. It was dangerous enough to scare away potential customers, such as women and the elderly. Kettering's electric starter motor, which was an adaptation of the motor he'd used in his electric cash register, changed all that, and in the process, enabled women and the elderly to get behind the wheel, the merits of which you should also discuss in the comments. After a successful demonstration for Cadillac in 1911, an order for 12,000 units was placed, and Delco was in business. 5 years later, Kettering indeed sold the company to United Motors for an eye-watering $9 million. By the time Kettering died in 1958, Thomas Edison was the only American credited with more major inventions. However, the man we're interested in, the man with one of the most unfortunate legacies in science, is Thomas Midgley Jr. Born in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania on May 18, 1889, 54 years before Joe Willie Namath, he was the only child of Thomas Midgley Sr. and Hattie Emerson Midgley. In his youth, Midgley Sr. was a national champion on something called a high bicycle and a prolific inventor thereafter. He called it a career in 1927 after 25 years of research in the rubber industry, specifically automobile tyres, and is credited with inventing the first demountable tyre rim. Hattie's side of the family traced their lineage from Ralph Waldo Emerson, and her father, James Emerson, invented the inserted tooth saw, dying with 56 patents to his name. Invention, then, was in Midgley's genes. Hindsight suggests it would have been better for everyone had it stayed there. Instead, he began laying the foundations of his career by studying mechanical engineering at Cornell University. Before completing his studies in 1911, the NCR's head chemist visited Cornell, singled Midgley out from his class, and offered him a position with the company upon graduation. Edward Deeds, by now NCR General Manager, assigned Midgley to Inventions Department No. 3 as a draftsman and designer, the same department where Charles Kettering got his start 7 years earlier. He spent a year there before the first miracle of his career occurred. Midgley left the NCR without Patterson firing him, and went to work as chief engineer for his father at Midgley Tire and Rubber Company. When that business failed in 1916, he took a job at Delco, a decision that had profound implications. It was an inauspicious start. When Kettering first met Midgley, he mistook him for a salesman. His first assignment at Delco sounds like the dullest task any human has ever undertaken. Finished development of a built-in hydrometer for indicating the degree of charge in the storage battery of a Delcolite farm lighting set. This was duck soup for a man of Midgley's ingenuity, so he went to his boss, Kettering, and asked what, with hindsight, might be the most dangerous question anyone has ever asked.
What do you want me to do next, boss? Hey, I'm addressing you.
Engine knock was a problem that had bothered Kettering ever since I began spreading the rumour that his electric starter caused it in 1912. But what is engine knock, you ask? Well, it really couldn't be simpler. And it isn't. A car engine is, in essence, a space designed to safely and discreetly withstand explosions thousands of times a minute for years. These explosions happen inside the cylinders in a cycle which looks like this. Each piston is connected to the crankshaft, which converts the piston's linear motion into rotational motion. Add some gears and a steering wheel, and you've got yourself a car. That's how an internal combustion engine should work. Knocking happens during the power stroke when the fuel-air mixture ignites unevenly, creating a shockwave that increases pressure in the cylinder. This shockwave can be heard outside the engine as a knock or a ping. At its mildest, Engine knock can lower your efficiency and power output. At its worst, it can completely banjax your engine. It was serious, and in 1916, no one knew precisely what caused it. Kettering's answer to Midgley's question was that a solution to this problem needed to be found. They agreed that seeing inside a running engine would help enormously, so one Saturday afternoon, they MacGyvered a method of doing so with 2 bits of wood, 2 nails, rubber bands, a tomato can, and some photographic paper. By the evening, they had the first photographic records of pressure events inside engine cylinders. The problem was the fuel. It was common knowledge that kerosene knocked even worse than gasoline, and both Kettering and Midgley wondered if it could be because kerosene didn't vaporize as quickly. One of them recalled that the trailing arbutus blooms early in the year, even in frost and snow, due to its red-back leaves absorbing more heat. Maybe if kerosene was dyed red, it too would absorb heat faster, vaporize quicker, and burn just like gasoline. So Midgley schlepped over to the Delco Chemical Lab on East 2nd Street in Dayton to find himself some red dye. As luck would have it, the closest thing he could get hold of was iodine. Against all odds, logic and common sense, it worked, although not for the reason Midgley and Kettering had supposed. Iodine was a knock suppressor in its own right. Its colour was irrelevant. Unfortunately, iodine couldn't be used in any practical sense, since it was scarce and damaged both the fuel and the engine, but it did prove that knock could be eliminated. Armed with this information, Kettering decided that now was as good a time as any to set up a separate laboratory to study how fuels burn inside engines. They were just settling into an old converted Victorian house on North Ludlow Street in Dayton when the US entered the First World War on August 6, 1917. The war changed nothing for Midgley. Instead of trying to solve the engine knock problem, he was reassigned, along with men from the Bureau of Mines, to produce an aviation fuel capable of higher power output for the new Liberty engine designed for use in American planes. Rumour had it, falsely as it happened, that the Germans were using cyclohexane as fuel for their fighters and bombers. This was where Midgley started. Cyclohexane is produced by hydrogenating benzene. Now, I'm too stupid to understand what that means, but I know that when Midgley tried it, he damn near blinded himself. A fusible plug in a hydrogen tank exploded and spat metal into the cornea of one of his eyes. His doctor couldn't pick it out without risking Midgley's sight, so Midgley, with characteristic intelligent ignorance, improvised. He removed the shards of metal by bathing his eye with purified mercury, and it healed completely. After months of experimentation, setbacks, obstacles, and potential maimings, a breakthrough came. Midgley's 70-30 blend of cyclohexane and benzene was the first synthetic aviation fuel. Although it was successfully tested and manufactured, the war was over before it could be put into service. Around the same time, the US Army Aircraft Board approached Kettering with a proposal. The Army liked the idea of bombing the enemy. It was good for morale. Unfortunately, to do so, they had to risk the pilots' lives by having them fly over enemy territory. Was there a way he, Charles F. Kettering, could make it so the planes could do the bombing on their own? Kettering designed the first fully functioning flying bomb, a precursor to the cruise missile, affectionately known as the Kettering bug. It looked like a regular biplane that was either small or far away, and was designed to be stuffed with explosives, fly to its destination, shut its engine off, divest its wings, and crash expensively in the vicinity of the enemy. Orville Wright was a consultant on the project, and Elmer Ambrose Sperry, the father of modern navigation technology, designed the guidance and control systems. The development of these control systems became Midgley's side gig for the remainder of the war.